Hello, my name is Craig Bryan. I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for Veteran Studies at the University of Utah, and I'm also the lead author of a recently published paper looking at deployment and combat exposure with suicide risk amongst military personnel and veterans. This study has garnered a lot of questions and discussion about the topic of military suicide, and so I wanted to take some time to clarify what we have actually found and to answer some of the questions that have been raised from the study. There's been a lot of confusion regarding whether or not deployment might be related to suicide risk amongst military personnel. The reason why there's so much confusion is that these different studies seem to come up with different answers. And so in the past year alone, for instance, there was one study that came out early last year saying there was no relationship of deployment with suicide risk. Then another study came out a few months later saying there was a relationship of deployment with suicide risk. And then just 1 month ago, a third study came out saying no, there actually is no relationship. And so you can understand why there's been a lot of debate and a lot of discussion about this issue. What we found in our meta-analysis of 22 different studies on the topic is that part of the confusion is because researchers go about doing things in different ways. When a researcher asks the question, is deployment history related to suicide risk? In general, we do not find a strong relationship. If, however, a researcher asks the question and researches a very specific issue of combat, which is exposure to killing and death while you're deployed, we actually do find that there is a consistent relationship of killing and death with subsequent suicide-related outcomes. And I guess the answer would be no, it's not obvious, at least not to many. I do think that for many military personnel and veterans who have deployed, especially those who have been exposed to these types of events in combat, it might actually seem quite intuitive, but there are a lot of individuals for whom the distinction between deployment versus exposure to death and killing is not quite so obvious, oftentimes because they've not deployed. And to them, when they think of deployment, what they're thinking of is very intense combat exposure, whereas when you actually look at what deployment means in the military, there are many service members and veterans who deploy but are never exposed to these types of events. And so deployment does not equal exposure to killing and does not equal exposure to death. First off, I think it's important to note that when you look at these professions like firefighters and police officers and other professions that are routinely exposed to killing and death, like for instance surgeons or other specialty disciplines in medicine, you actually do see elevated suicide rates relative to other careers and professions that might not be exposed to these types of events. So I do think actually that the findings specific to the military are actually applicable to non-military professions as well. The reason why we maybe aren't seeing increased rates amongst these other non-military professions is because, there's not necessarily that I'm aware of an increase in killing and death and violence and accidents, etc., in general across society, whereas over the past decade or so, as we have been engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, a larger and larger number of military personnel are being exposed to these types of events, whereas during peacetime, they might not necessarily have experienced these events. I think that's actually an important observation. Many people actually are completely unaware of the fact that the majority of military suicides are amongst those who have never deployed. And our research has really tried to emphasize this point, is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that we need to look at different subgroups of military personnel and veterans. And I think that's what we're really trying to do with this study, is say, we're not trying to explain or understand suicide in every single service member. I don't think that there is one answer for everyone. But what we were really trying to do in this study is look at, of those who have deployed, why is it that some service members and veterans who have deployed are maybe at increased risk, but others are not? What kind of differentiates between those individuals? And what the results here suggest is that one of the factors might be what happens to you while you're deployed. Unfortunately, we don't have a crystal clear answer to that yet, but some of the research that we've also been doing here at the center suggests that one possibility is that exposure to these types of events really affects us psychologically. So many service members who have been exposed to killing and death often report things like guilt and shame or difficulty with forgiving themselves and forgiving others. So they tend to be very self-critical, or they feel isolated or detached from others who maybe they feel don't understand them as well. And so we'll continue to research this issue, but I think this is a major motivator for why we did this study, so that we could start figuring out, instead of looking at all service members and veterans as one group, let's look at all these different subgroups, because maybe there are unique needs and unique strategies that will work for different individuals depending on what they've experienced during their military service. I hope those answers help to clarify and explain some of the results of this study. And I look forward to continued discussion and conversation, as more questions arise, we'll do our best to answer them so that we can make sure that we're doing everything possible to help service members and veterans, to help them live lives that are worth living. Thank you. You can find us online or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.